Great, welcome everybody. This is an interactive panel on measuring work-based learning. I think maybe we'll give people just another minute or two to come in from the last session. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat and just share, in particular, if there's a state or school district or higher ed system that you primarily work with, if you want to share that. So if we now have a little sense of who's in the room, that would be great. Thanks to those who are joining from the train or other places in motion. Wonderful. Well, it seems like we've got a pretty good group here. The panelists, should we go ahead and jump in? So thank you everyone for joining. This is an interactive panel discussion on measuring work-based learning. And if you, as we're getting started here with introductions, if you want to just drop your name and say hello in the chat, and also let us know what state or school district or institution of higher education that you primarily work with, that'd be great, just to get a sense of who's in the room. So my name is Catherine Shields. I'm a researcher at EDC. And we'll get started today with a short welcome and introductions, and also a quick overview of what we mean by work-based learning. And then we'll dive into the discussion that will be really the meat of the session. We'll talk primarily about three questions, looking at how available work-based learning data are, talking about some innovative approaches that we've seen in states and districts to address those challenges, and also some considerations for researchers who are working with work-based learning data. So for each of those questions, we'll take about 10 minutes to hear from a couple of panelists, and then we'll have about 10 minutes to open it up to all of you to share, either coming off mute or sharing in the chat questions and thoughts that you have. And I'd also say, please jump on the chat anytime to share a question or thought, and we'll keep monitoring that and be sure we get back to you as we go. And we'll wrap up this session with some closing reflections on what you think are the implications from what you've heard for your work. So why don't we start with introductions, and perhaps we could just go through in the order that we appear on the slide. So Sean, do you want to start by introducing yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Doherty. I'm a professor of education and policy at Boston College, and I'm a former high school educator, assistant principal, and liaison to a regional technical school outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And my work focuses on youth transition to adulthood and career and technical education in particular. I'm a part of a few different IES-funded research teams related to CTE, including the CTE Research Network lead, where we've been thinking a lot about different dimensions of youth experience and work-based learning. And so it's nice to be with you all.
I can go next. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Angela Estacion. I'm a senior research associate at WestEd, and I also serve as the research and evaluation lead for WestEd's newly formed Center for Economic Mobility. I'm based here in Tampa, Florida, and a lot of my research has been in partnership with institutions from the Florida college system, the state university system, and then most recently through an IES-funded study on CTE and labor market alignment, which is in partnership with the Florida Department of Education's Division of Career and Adult Education. My research is primarily mixed method studies on access to and readiness for post-secondary training and education, and supporting successful post-secondary pathways with a particular focus on CTE programs and work-based learning. The study that I think I was invited to kind of reflect on today was actually a NSF-funded study focused on work-based learning in Florida's college system in collaboration with JFF. So happy to be here, thank you.
All right, and I guess I'll go next. I'm Brian Hutchins. I'm a senior research specialist at the Serve Center at UNC Greensboro in North Carolina. I work on a few IES-funded projects, including currently an evaluation of North Carolina's statewide dual enrollment program, Career and College Promise. But today I'm here to talk about the work I'm doing, collaborating with others on the panel for the CTE research network study of how districts are collecting and using work-based learning data. So I just want to say we're still very much in the middle of data collection for that project, but we're happy to share some of our initial kind of high-level findings and discuss.
Yeah, hi everyone. I am Kelly Reese. I'm a senior researcher at AIR. I'm located outside Chicago, and I do CTE and work-based learning research at the organization. I'm currently leading some work in the REL Midwest on CTE and work-based learning in Indiana. And I'm a part of the CTE Research Network and project director currently for the study that Brian mentioned, the supplemental study of district work-based learning data systems. And happy to be here.
Great, thank you all. So I'm the moderator today. I'm Catherine Shields, and I'm a researcher at EDC. My work focuses on college and career readiness, and I'm especially interested in work-based learning in the context of high school career and technical education. I've been working with school districts and state agencies in Vermont, Rhode Island, Mississippi, California, and some other places on how they can develop valid and reliable measures of career tech ed implementation, and including work-based learning. I'm doing that in part through a current IES-funded research grant studying career academy outcomes, and also through work with the regional educational laboratories Northeast and Islands. I do want to acknowledge also a colleague, Lois Joy from JFF, which is one of the lead organizations of the IES CTE Research Network. She's also worked with Angela and Sean and myself on this topic. And a big thank you to Corinne Alfeld, our program officer for many of our grants and contracts here, who's always been wonderful with support and guidance for the work that we're doing. So I'd like to just start by grounding our conversation and kind of having a shared understanding of what we mean by work-based learning. Because people really will refer to a lot of different things with that term and use a range of definitions. And I'm showing the definition from the Perkins legislation that guides career tech education in the K-12 space, because it captures a couple of key elements of work-based learning, having workplace and employer interaction with the student, and also linking intentionally to a program of instruction. And we're in this panel really going to think about the full continuum of work-based learning experiences. So some of you may be familiar with this continuum that was developed by ConnectEd in collaboration with a lot of folks from the field, but really conceptualizes these experiences as starting with awareness and exploration that are kind of lighter touch activities that might be like a job shadow or a career fair participation, and then move into more intensive and intentional experiences at the preparation stage where you're learning through a work experience. We often think of internships as kind of the classic example of that, but this could also include an integrated project-based learning activity that engages heavily with an employer, or it could be a student-run enterprise, et cetera. And then at the far end of the continuum, you have what is referred to as participation, where you're learning for a particular occupation through something like an apprenticeship. Practicum might lead to a credential that's recognized by the industry. So if you look at state metrics, for example, a lot of times they may just refer to that like preparation and participation piece, like internships and apprenticeships. But we're going to be sort of addressing that full continuum that starts with awareness in our conversation today. We also wanted to just remind folks that work-based learning takes place in so many different settings. It may be required for a lot of high school career tech pathways, but it's also happening in comprehensive high schools in their academic programs. It could happen through a youth workforce development program that's an alternative outside the K-12 system. At the post-secondary level, it could be part of a technical training program in a certificate program, or it could be part of an associate's or bachelor's program. And of course, these days, it's often happening virtually as well. So just a reminder that there's a lot of different settings. So why did we convene this panel? Why does high quality work-based learning data matter? Well, as folks in the room probably know, there's a limited amount of really rigorous causal research about career technical education in general, and it's especially an issue for work-based learning. We don't have a lot of studies that can really link the students' experience and participation in work-based learning to what kind of outcomes they experience. And part of this is due to a lack of data that would support such studies, especially administrative data that's routinely collected on a large scale. Another trend that we're seeing was that states are viewing work-based learning as really important to educational experiences, and they're adding it to their accountability systems at the K-12 level, both through in the comprehensive general education metrics under ESSA, or the Every Student Succeeds Act, but also through Perkins for career technical education. And in fact, more than half of the states now have work-based learning as a Perkins indicator. And finally, better data can be really valuable for educators in schools and college campuses as they think about their program planning and improvement. So for all those reasons, we've really thought it was important to focus on improving work-based learning data. So let's pause for a sec, and we wanted to do a little poll quickly to get a sense of who's in the room and your experience. So you should see two questions pop up on your screen. And the first one is just asking, what is your primary role? I think maybe these questions will come up one at a time. So first question is just, what's your primary role? Are you in a research role primarily? Are you working at a school? Are you working at a district or local education agency level, state agency, or are you in higher ed? And just like picking the closest thing you can to it. That's what you have. Give people just a minute to answer that. Okay, great. So it looks like we've got a nice mix of folks in the room. A lot of researchers, as we would expect for this conference, but a few folks from higher ed as well, and a couple of folks in other roles. So thank you for participating. Let me see if I can get us to our second question now. And I'm going to ask our tech to just help with getting to the second question in the poll. I don't know if you can launch that for me. Looks like it may not be working, but so I guess what would be helpful is if you could just answer in the chat. And the question is, oh no, here, no, it looks like that's the same question again. That's okay. We can sort of do this without the poll. If you could just answer in the chat, like what is your experience using work-based learning data? Are you using it in your research? Have you helped design a work-based learning system? Or are you more of a user of work-based learning data to inform work that you're doing? So just take a second to answer that in the chat. I'll give people a couple of minutes. You can answer the quickie, like using for research, no experience, developing a system, just a quick statement would be fine. So it looks like a lot of folks are using work-based learning data in their research, which makes sense. We have a lot of researchers in the house, a few folks with no experience and hoping to learn more, which is great. All right, good. Thank you. So I think you've come to the right place. We're definitely going to be talking about some issues that will pertain to your research uses of work-based learning. So why don't we move on to our first discussion question. So we'd like to talk about the extent to which these work-based learning data that are reliable and valid, they are collected consistently, to what extent are they available in secondary and post-secondary systems? And what challenges are there for accurate measurement of work-based learning participation? So I'm going to invite a couple of our panelists to talk about this for a little bit to start us off. And Sean, you could share your experience from working with some state agencies on this question.
Sure. So I didn't frame this in my introduction, but I'll just add piece here that I'm part of a multi-state research lab, the Career and Technical Education Policy Exchange, hosted through Georgia State University's Georgia Policy Labs, and it includes the states of Michigan, Massachusetts, Washington, Montana, Tennessee, and Metro Atlanta, and we're in the process of adding Texas and Rhode Island. And what we try to do is come to shared understandings of what we're measuring and how what we measure relates to student experience and outcomes. And actually, we now have a grant to look at educator workforce related to CTE as well. And in that work, one of the dimensions that we're trying to understand across all state contexts is work-based learning, the extent to which it's incorporated into secondary CTE experiences, and then how it's captured. So related to this point, I'd say looking across the states in preparation for today, I gathered or kind of tried to capture some of the ways in which the data are collected across these states. Some states like Tennessee have a capstone course that's defined for every program of study that exists and is offered in the state. And so that is a 4-credit course that gets captured in their student level course taking data, and students receive credit for doing this course. And each course has a slightly different set of prescribed activities, but all of it incorporates work-based learning aligned with that program of study as a capstone. In addition to capstone courses, at least a few of the states, including Washington State and Massachusetts, also have credit-bearing courses that have the work-based learning moniker. My understanding in talking to folks in Massachusetts, which is the partnership that I lead, suggests that what that means is quite different across schools, and kind of whether and how that gets used as a means to measure work-based learning is not necessarily standardized. In some settings, there's a database of work-based learning for pay, so paid internships in addition to credit-bearing programs. This seems like it's not super common in large urban districts that have these, especially summer work programs. This is sometimes captured, at least in our contexts. Industry recognized credentials have also been named as ways that work-based learning experiences might be captured. So to the extent that work hours are required to be eligible to obtain an industry recognized credential, or it sounds like in some of these state contexts, they're being used as a proxy for work-based learning. So a work adjacent experience, but not necessarily requiring face-to-face experiences. And then finally, in Massachusetts, I was told that workforce investment boards across regions in the state work in partnership with some states to define experiences and or co-collect data with employers in those parts of the state that offer work-based learning experiences for youth. But so just to summarize, I think the extent to which the available measures, at least in these states where we're working in partnership, are valid and reliable, I'd say in states that are like Tennessee that have a capstone course that relates to every program of study, I think there's a greater degree of reliability and probably the validity of inferences we might make about the relationship between, say, that experience and some other outcome or experience. But in other state contexts, in particular in Massachusetts, they're very much in the process of trying to decide on a systematic way to collect multiple dimensions of work-based learning that would be valid and reliable across all school settings. I'm happy to say more about that in discussion, but that it's definitely a challenge outside of maybe the industry recognized credentials, which now in Massachusetts are captured in a uniform centralized data system. Otherwise, it doesn't seem like it's very uniform at this point.
Thanks, Sean. And it'd be great, Angela, to hear from you. What are you seeing in the post-secondary space in terms of available data?
Sure. And so our team recently, in collaboration with JFF, completed a study, as I mentioned before, using Florida's statewide longitudinal data system and looking specifically at the Florida college system. So that's what you would think of as community colleges, though they do offer 4-year degrees. And so our work, while we intended to study a broader, kind of more inclusive definition of work-based learning kinds of opportunities based on data availability within the within the longitudinal data system, we were only able to focus in on internships and cooperative education. And so that's aligned, I think, with what Sean's talking about in terms of credit bearing. And so data limitations are really, we're finding often only available when it's associated with a credit bearing coursework. And then even within those, within an examination of those two particular types of work-based learning opportunities, there's also variation. And so there's no standards, again, like you can identify credit-bearing internship, but there are no additional data points on paid or unpaid location of internship. So nothing about the quality of internships, let's say, and classroom time and how that's connected to the classroom, if it's connected to the classroom. So there are a lot of things I think that are still missing in this particular post-secondary system that we came across. And I would say that with Florida's data in particular, even with the Florida statewide course numbering system, there's still a lot of limitations. And so I think a good example of what has been happening in Florida, the Department of Ed in Florida received money through advanced CTE to develop their work-based learning indicator, and held some really good data summits, bringing together stakeholders to try and identify, what would we want to collect if we could collect anything at all. And so much useful information was brought together, and many of that having to do with what I talked about, which was paid and unpaid was one of the big things that always comes up, and some other elements. And so there was this movement towards improving data collection across the state, and it stalled the last time that I checked in with our contacts there. And it really, I think the challenge to collecting the data had to do with not having an incentive or mandates to collect the data. And so should they proceed with requiring that kind of information to be collected by the folks at the college system, they didn't believe that the data would be accurate. And so it's been a scaled back process so that there's a slight tweak to the data element within the system, but not to the extent that that they wanted to, and that would really be able to look at some of the things that might get at quality of work-based learning and differentiators of different types of work-based learning opportunities.
Thank you, Angela and Sean. So let me open it up to folks who are participating in the room, and you can come off mute, or you can use the hand raise function if you want, or you're welcome to just put a question in the chat and I can read it out to folks. But what have your experiences been with kind of the state of data for work-based learning in the setting that you work in, and what are your thoughts on ways to address that?
Hi, this is Eric Bruner. I did put this in the chat, but we don't have direct access to work-based learning data in Connecticut. But we do have access through something called the P20 WIN to access on labor data containing both earnings and industry codes, specific industry codes for all the students in our sample. And what that allows us to do is look at which students are working while they're still in high school and exactly which industry, and see if that industry matches their program of study. And that becomes a good proxy. Well, we think it's a good proxy for work-based learning, work-based opportunities. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Eric. So we have a question from Holly Zanville. Have you found that work-based learning is caught on the high school transcript, on the college transcript? And if so, are transcripts a good source for data analysis?
So I'll just jump in and say my colleagues at Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, I don't think there's anyone on from the agency, had said that they didn't necessarily feel like it was going to be systematic across schools within the state. In Massachusetts, we have what are known as regional vocational and technical high schools. So full-time, like a whole school model of CTE, similar to what exists in Connecticut, New York City, and New Jersey, but not many other places that I'm aware of across the US. I was told in those schools, it is, and perhaps some others less reliably, systematically used. In Tennessee, it would be more reliable because it's been built into the state longitudinal data system and part of the revamping of their programs of study. I think it might differ depending on the state or district context.
Thanks, Sean. Do other folks have experience with that using the transcript data? On the panel or off? Anybody else can answer? I will say, I'm just working with folks in Rhode Island. That's a system where there is sort of work-based learning flagged as part of the student's record with a fair amount of detail, but the sort of consistency of capturing that accurately and fully and getting districts to report it consistently continues to be a real challenge. Other questions or thoughts for folks, Angela?
No, I was just going to say at the college level, as I mentioned, it's really the credit-based coursework. So our data did come from the college transcripts, student level college transcripts, but it was only we were only able to capture credit-based internships and credit-based cooperative education coursework. So it is limited in the types of things that you're able to get from some college transcripts.
Looks like Jenna Terrell, did you want to share what you were seeing in Florida? You had something in the chat.
I think I just said what Angela said. Just was typing it as she was saying it. We have a tendency to do that.
You're sharing a brain.
Yeah, so Jenna worked closely with the data on the study with JFF, and so we are often saying the same things at the same time. Thanks, Jenna.
Great. Other folks' experiences elsewhere? So Holly, you also raised learning and employment records, and whether that might be a source. I don't know if anybody's worked with that or has thoughts on that. Or Holly, if you want to jump off mute, you're welcome to share your thoughts on how that might work.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi. It may be that there's more talk than action yet around the LERSs, but a lot of the foundations are starting to support developments. I think more at the post-secondary level, but my guess is it's going to be impacting K-12 also. So this could be a new development in the next few years, particularly with ed tech companies. And Mark talked this morning about the growing importance of ed tech and the vendors, et cetera. So as they're pushing for interoperable records and particularly the LERSs, I personally think there's going to be more attention to this. I don't know how fast it will grow, but there will be spots around the country where we'll probably see more of this. So we're really interested in this as a potential data source down the road.
Great, thanks, Holly. I had a good question from Jamie Timmons. Are you seeing work-based learning appearing as part of an IEP record for students with disabilities? Is that a potential source?
So I do some work in this space, but I have not had systematic access to IEPs to know if it's written in. I don't know. I know. I was going to say, Allison, I was expecting could jump in. She just did in the chat. Thanks, Allison. Yeah, as part of their employment transition services, it could be written in. And Allison, jump in if this is not correct. Like as part of what should be happening, the extent to which what actually happens in practice, being experienced, being registered, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much right, Sean. There's something called pre-employment transition services, which is part of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, which is not necessarily the same as Perkins, but there's a lot of overlap, I think, sometimes. And so I think there's a mechanism for it to be written into the IEP essentially, but I don't know how well that's actually carried out in practice. But pre-ETS is like sort of the mechanism that you would use to push that forward.
Anecdotally, I have a PhD student at Vanderbilt who's studying exactly this and working at youth with disability, working with youth with disabilities at the point of transition, and it's the enacting of it that where there seems to be potential to be a high degree of variability even when it's written in.
Good. Well, I think we'll move on to our next question now that we've sort of spent some time thinking about what's actually out there. I know there's a lot still even to learn about exploring sort of all the places that these data live currently and how accurate they are. But I'm going to ask the panel to now turn your attention to thinking about what are some of the innovative approaches that you're seeing, given that it is so difficult to collect these data and there's a lack of reliable data. What are you seeing either in states and districts or on college campuses to gather better quality data? And I'm going to ask Brian to kick us off on this to talk a little bit about the study that you've been doing with our team on that topic.
Sure. And I just want to say, since we're focused kind of on the innovation and promising practices, we're going to highlight here some of the really good things, but there are challenges we've noticed as well that we can discuss as those come up. And I also want to say, Kelly, jump in at any point. I have a few high-level takeaways, but feel free to fill in and add. The first thing, just for context, the state, we're not identifying the districts here, but we're working with districts in Colorado, Delaware, Georgia, Florida, and Wisconsin. And I think really focusing on the district has helped us see what's going on at the district level and seeing what data are making their way up to the state systems. So I think our high level takeaway is there's a lot that's being collected that's not being making its way into the state systems. And that's kind of what I wanted to focus on. So in general, and I don't want to paint with a broad brush strokes here, but we're seeing the districts that we're working with definitely, I think, internships and things like the preparation and participation activities for course credit. Oh, thank you, Catherine. I forgot to say, these are kind of the things we're looking at here. I'm not going to talk about these, but I want to provide this as a high level in case you're not familiar with work-based learning. These are kind of where we're pointing our attention. But what I was saying is we're seeing the data that's going to the state typically are tied to course credits and things like that, meeting Perkins quality indicator data requirements, focusing on CTE concentrators and things like that. But what we're seeing in several of the districts we're working with, they're collecting a lot of information kind of on those awareness and exploration activities, things that don't typically get captured in the state system. And I think that's really interesting. Like we're working with a district in Florida, and they're using a student learning, not Florida, sorry, Colorado, and they're using a student learning plan system, Zello. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It's kind of similar to Naviance or Major Clarity or some of those other. And they're actually capturing longitudinally from 6th grade the work-based learning activities kind of across the continuum. And that's something really powerful they're doing, where they can look at those connections and the activities the students are doing in middle school, and really helping find opportunities in internships, apprenticeships, things like that, as they transition into high school. And so that's really powerful. And they can really, with that information through a database like that, they can really drill down and identify areas where either certain students aren't getting the experiences that they might need. Like I remember CTE coordinator we talked to talking about, she could identify there's how many plumbing, students are wanting to be involved in plumbing, and there's not enough opportunities for them. So they can really dive in deep into their data that they have and use it for kind of improving their programs and for implementation. One of the things that we're seeing is, looking at these awareness and exploration activities, is it's always easier to capture in the group, like the number of students that participated. We're actually seeing in these systems where they're tracking at the student level. So teachers and students can go in some cases, and it varies by district, but they can go in and or a work-based learning coordinator can go in and build into the system like this activity and then tag students that participated in that activity as a way to capture that information. And there's one district we're working with, it's not fully in use, but the students themselves, in addition to being tagged into the activity, they can go in and tag specific employability skills that they felt like they gained from that experience. And then that's verified by a teacher or a work-based learning coordinator. So that's, I think, one thing that we're finding is a lot more of that data is coming out that's not being captured necessarily in the state system. But one of the things, in my background, I have a little bit of a background in data management, so I think about data systems, and we're seeing that districts are trying to introduce kind of more efficient and user-friendly options to save time for those that are involved in the system, to improve buy-in, and to cut down on missing data and errors. And some are using third-party systems like Zello and some others. And we're seeing some districts are using kind of homegrown systems that they've developed. Like I'm working with a district in Georgia that that is using actually Google. So they're the only thing they have to pay for in their system, this electronic system, is some e-signature software that they're in Georgia. The state actually requires through this CNET database, a lot of information comes to the state, including students' work plans, both their employability skills and the technical skills they gain at either internships or apprenticeships or co-ops or whatever they're involved in. And so it's really hard with this system, to being a really small system, to find ways to collect and get that data into the state. And so they're using email triggers, or using online forms where they're trying to collect as much electronically as they can. And I think that's really innovative. And I think that, you know, it probably helps them more on the implementation side, but I think it probably helps everyone, you know, researchers like ourselves, if the quality is there kind of at the entry and tracking process as part of the implementation process. Just one other high level thing I want to share. We're seeing examples of where there are multiple kind of stakeholders involved in entering the data. So students have a role in entering data, teacher, district staff. And one I think is a big one is some employers can go into the systems and populate the systems with their information. And I think that's really neat. There's a district that the students themselves can go in and they can look for their own internships, or they look for job shadowing opportunities, and they can make connections directly with employers. And that's really powerful. It gives the students kind of more ownership of that system. And so, and one thing too, it really cuts down on staff needing to kind of reach out. I mean, there's obviously collaboration and onboarding potential employers and other community partners, but it captures them in the system where it can take out some of the need for getting, you know, agreements in place and kind of tracking the information about the employers. And just some other quick level innovations we're noticing is like just like trying to use more QR codes to collect data. One of the data systems has, and I think this is in Delaware, they have videos that can answer questions as teachers and students are going in and using the system, or they're embedding the work-based learning data collection system in classroom portals, so students don't have to log into it and have problems getting into it. So there are all these little things I wish we had time to go into detail and talk about, but unfortunately we don't. But I'm gonna pause there for a moment and see if Kelly, if there's anything that you want to add, because I know I've just scratched the surface with some things that we're seeing.
Yeah, no, you covered a lot. Thank you, Brian. I think one thing that I just wanted to mention too about use of data and thinking about incentives that school systems might have to be collecting this. It's the district, I believe, in Florida that we're profiling. We're in the middle of learning about this, but they have a strong connection with their county workforce board, and they're providing opportunities for students and really monitoring that data a lot. And so I think when a whole ecosystem is on the same page, looking at the same data, that provides a lot of incentive for it to be collected and for it to be accurate in the first place. I think
Great. Thanks, Brian and Kelly. And Angela, you were just mentioning that Florida is adopting one of these systems.
Yeah, it's gonna be their statewide system, both for college and career readiness and also for this work-based learning component that Brian was talking about. So I am curious. That was I am curious when I talked to them at Florida Department of Ed, how that's going to play out, because I mean, it's such a heavy lift to collect this kind of data. It's not just having the system in place. So I'm curious to hear more about how that's going, Brian, in your work when you learn more.
And I was going to say, with the district that we're working in Florida, they actually have been working with the state because they were kind of spearheading developing a system or using a system. And so there have been some conversations on how to share data up with the state. Now, I think they're currently using a different system than Zello right now. So they're, I think they're probably gonna have to transition, but I think they were part of those conversations about how to collect data. That's what we've been learning from that particular district.
Yeah, and I'll just say to add that, actually, let me stop and take Kathy's question. Brian, you mentioned the use of QR codes. Is there more you could say about that, how that works?
The context I was thinking of, and this is where I don't have complete details, but it was one of the districts where they wanted to just embed in the system that students were using QR codes, because they just knew kids had their phones, and it was like to link them to information. There was actually, linking them to the QR code versus clicking on a link seemed to work better for the student. So it wasn't, it was one of those quick, neat things that they were doing that I don't know that was a major component or feature of their system.
And I think it goes back to that theme that I think you already mentioned, Brian, of there seems to be a trend to have teachers enter data less because it's a burden of time. And there hopefully then is some other way that that's verified by teachers, but that if they're not the ones doing the original data entry, then that's preferable.
And we've heard people say that specific, like we want to take less time for the teachers to do it. But, you have to have district folks that can help, and you have to have others, and relying on the students themselves to enter a lot of the data, but it still has to be verified.
Yeah, thank you. Sean, do you have other thoughts on what innovations you've seen at the state agency level? Like, what are things that folks are doing that stand out?
So I would say, like Tennessee is the most explicit that I've seen in terms of really harmonizing, like setting parameters for what would constitute a capstone experience, what sorts of things would have to go into it, and then making sure that every pathway has one. That said, that's all in the sort of credit bearing space. And I would say some of what Brian and Kelly were sharing about their experiences working with these districts sounds like it's similar to what maybe Massachusetts is trying to do in coming up with ways to capture the data differently. So there's a few different partnerships. One is called the Commonwealth Corporation, and it's a public-private venture that's focused on I think trying to get youth some employment experience, a lot in the summer, some year round. And then these regional efforts by the local workforce investment boards seems like it relates to some of what's come up already around trying to cross-validate self-reported data from youth and from employers, and reducing the burden on the schools themselves, since often like they have some like statutory responsibility, but are not actually at the center of where things are happening. And it's relating to the earlier point about like reliability and validity. It seems like building something that's like not too onerous, but plays to respective incentives, and where we can cross-validate what folks are reporting. It seems like where at least Massachusetts and at least one other state in our multi-state lab are trying to move.
Great, thanks, Sean. Let me open it up to folks in the room. What are you seeing out there? Do these types of examples resonate with you? Are you seeing some different interesting things that are happening either in K through 12 or in college level? And you can either drop in the chat or you can just speak up or use the raise hand, whatever is easy for you. Anything that you're just questions you have about the examples that were given. Well, folks are thinking about it. I just wanted to build on something that Brian said, that, mentioning some of these kind of purpose-built database systems that we're seeing a lot of the time, where it feels like a lot of the main student information system databases maybe don't, sometimes they try to build a module into something like that, but often they aren't really like purpose-built for something like work-based learning. So we're seeing a lot of these other third-party systems, like, we've heard of folks using Transeo. There's something called the Agriculture Education Tracker, AET. There's a group that I'm working with, and for the IES-funded grant in California, they took a system called 5-Star Student that was actually built for student activities and sort of repurposed that for work-based learning. And what we found that's interesting there is that those kinds of systems do seem to allow some of these districts to be able to track more granularity, like how many hours did the student spend on any given activity, or linking an activity to the pathway, the CTE pathway the student is in, or that kind of thing. But the other thing that is interesting is that there are some of the smaller districts that have felt like, let's make it work with Google Sheets because it's an investment to get the licenses and to train folks. And so if there's a sort of a smaller scope or, fewer students or less resources, that we actually have seen some really creative and well done large systems that are spreadsheet based, and that they're able to actually get a lot out of that. But that it can be really hard to then get those data to link up with one student information system, which would make things more consistent.
And I was going to add, and I don't know that, our districts are representative because we're trying to find innovative ones. But I think in most cases, even if they're using a third-party system, there's been a lot of collaboration with the developers to really help them kind of fine-tune things that they need. We're hearing a lot of examples. So again, I don't know how that happens, but we are hearing that, the AET or Zello or whoever, and we're not plugging for any of these, but they're really reaching out to get some of the customization that they need to make it work in their context.
Other thoughts from folks? Questions?
I have a question. I'm just curious if you've seen any, there's investment in, and Sean, I know you probably know this, there's a huge investment in summer employment in Boston. And I think that comes out of a different path than the education system. And I'm just curious as to whether, and this is something they've been working on for my entire career, so at least 30 years, I'm just curious, is there any effort to, with some of the SLDS funding where they're trying to bring data together, have you seen any effort to bring kind of cross the silos and collect those data in meaningful ways, if nothing else, just to assess even if a summer program is good or not?
So specifically trying to evaluate those summer programs, kind of like the evaluation of like the summer youth employment program in New York City.
Yeah, it just seems like there's a lot of push towards this work-based learning element and capturing that, and the K-12 side of things, or really secondary primarily side of things. And those would be like a baby step in the right direction, potentially. I'm just curious if you've seen any nudging around that.
So I know they are trying to move to capture it more systematically, and I think the idea is that then, if to the extent that they can measure it better, that we'd want to then look at, for instance, post high school employment outcomes or earnings contemporaneous while enrolled in college, something to that effect. Right now, because one set of schools has it bound up as part of the like definition of what it means to be treated in that school, it's part of the theory of action around what constitutes differences in outcomes we see between one set of school experiences and others. But I think that there's a real desire to understand to what extent we can decompose, let's say, a suite of experiences that we call CTE or secondary CTE, and understand to what extent even if actually it's not in the CTE context, but if someone got work-based learning experience,
Right.
like how does
Anywhere.
that, exactly, anywhere. So I think there's a real interest in that, but anyway, anecdotally, I haven't seen it come up in terms of like a priority or opportunity to do that yet.
Yeah. And Catherine, it seems like Rhode Island is pretty well positioned to get there. I'm just curious where they're at. I haven't heard about that much lately.
Yeah, Rhode Island is really interesting because they've really been thoughtful about, they have a sort of a bigger umbrella, Prepare Rhode Island initiative. So they have a mechanism for really bringing together different agencies that are offering work-based learning that might not be in K through 12 and might not be in higher ed. They have done some mapping of kind of who's collecting what and what's linkable. So they know, like, for example, there's some of the sort of summer internship programs that are offered through, I believe through Commerce that are, they've sort of figured out, okay, it's possible to get the student IDs here, we can put it together, but kind of getting, I think that at least the latest that I've heard, it's tricky to get that all knit together and takes a lot of investment and time and so on. So there's like the pieces are there and they're working towards it. And I think there's also thought about sort of definitions and trying to get on the same page of that. I know that's something we're working with in Vermont as well, like trying to think in these different systems when we say, how do these things translate that are happening in these different locations? So, but yeah, it's tricky and they're not there yet, I think. There was a question in the chat. Have researchers developed ideal models for what data should be collected in terms of the different variables for work-based learning?
Definitely would not posit it as an ideal model, but we did write like a thought paper, a white paper that's on the CTE Research Network website about like, advancing measures in CTE space, and work-based learning was a subsection of that. I think the like systematic collection, getting dosage, and different dimensions of the experience seemed like it would be really important. We did try with New York City data and another IES-funded project to look at program level reports of what work-based learning components were included, and like gauge the extent to which program level, not student exposure necessarily, but program level incorporated all three types of work-based learning experience on the continuum that Catherine showed earlier. The upshot was it was a lot noisier, even at the program level, a lot noisier than we would like. But I think it's possible to think about what exactly we would want and capture it at the program level. It's the student level exposure, I think, that we were talking through that was trickiest.
And I'll just share that in just a moment, I'll find that link to the paper that Sean mentioned, because that's a really great resource. And we also, through the IES-funded work I was mentioning in California on career academies, we did try to get towards that of mapping out what are the categories of data one should be collecting around work-based learning participation in particular, and sort of has a process. So that it's sort of, we developed this toolkit that I dropped in the chat that sort of helps the district think through a process, or a researcher to think through kind of what are the pieces that you need to be collecting data on, and how might you do that, and what are the challenges for that. So that's just another resource I'll share. But again, not a comprehensive piece, and I think that that's something that would be valuable for the field. Does anybody else know, anybody in the room know of other resources like that that are kind of like a model for which work-based learning variables should be collected?
I was going to plug Sean's paper, so he that's the first thing that came to mind.
Yeah, I'll pull that up. All right, well, why don't we move to our last question, which is, I think, of particular interest to folks in this room, which is, what should researchers be considering when using these kinds of data? And I'm going to ask Kelly to start us off to talk about it from your perspective with the IES CTE Research Network. What have you been saying there?
Sure. So one of the first things I think we should mention is, if possible, you want to factor in to your study a study of implementation, because as we've been talking about, there are so many different types of work-based learning that could be happening across the whole continuum, but even just within the immersive, the end of that continuum, like offsite paid internships, apprenticeships, simulated work-based learning in the classroom is becoming a lot more common. School-based enterprises, industry-sponsored competitions that may be happening over a longer period of time that the employer is really engaged, back and forth virtually or in person. So there's so much variation in what work-based learning can be, capturing as much as you can about exactly what it is and how it's implemented is important. As we've mentioned, just pulling together a couple of the pieces we've been saying, paying attention to career pathway or program of study that the work-based learning is situated in, and making sure that you can account for that variation is important. And I think overall, the hope is that we can get to a place where we understand which types of work-based learning are better for which types of students relatively. So it might be the case that the most vulnerable students are the ones that can benefit the most from work-based learning, but they might also have the most barriers, like transportation or not being documented to work in the United States, or scheduling issues due to already working outside of their school day to help support their families. And I think anything that you can work in to help think about how you can center those students so that they have equitable, high quality work-based learning experiences as well as important to be able to investigate that. And then, as we've been talking about, there's a lot potentially at the local level that's being collected, but it's hard to extract at the state level or later on. So if you can really talk through with a district what their existing data systems are that maybe you can mine for better information if it's not already quantified. So things like training plans might be available at the individual student level that would really detail what is supposed to be involved in their experience, the touch points that should be there between a work-based learning coordinator and an employer, getting at quality, being able to assess if that is really a supervised experience and to what extent it's supervised is something you may be able to mine from a plan. And then skills assessments, anytime that those exist, trying to get those at the student level to pull those in would be really valuable. So those are just a few things.
Thanks, Kelly. And Angela, what about in terms of researchers in the post-secondary space? What would you recommend?
I'm going to echo Kelly, like I echoed Sean. I think a lot of what we're seeing in the secondary space is also what we're seeing in the post-secondary space. My first point is exactly Kelly's first point about the implementation piece and really having that to complement the quantitative analyses of using the larger data sets. For our own work in Florida, really the context of specific institutions were all very different. And so understanding a college's policies and practices related to work-based learning, whether they're required for program completion or degree completion, things like that. These are all things that are really important, I think, to understanding the success of work-based learning. And then having the student perspective as well, I think is something that's really necessary for this kind of research and trying to understand the barriers to participation, because we know that at the post-secondary level, that there's uneven access and participation in work-based learning, especially in our study, especially in STEM work-based learning context. And then just understanding what kind of structures are in place. So we were finding that there were specific coordinators to develop these kinds of things, specific point people who are developing relationships with employers and kind of developing that. And those are sort of more long-term kinds of things that colleges need to invest in. And so these are the kinds of things that we will only get from really trying to understand the context of the colleges that these are happening in. And I'll stop right there.
Great, thank you, Angela. I'll just add, from our work with school districts, we found that a really important question to check on is variation. I think other folks have touched on this, but variation across work-based learning that's happening even within the same district or school. So for example, we've sometimes seen that particular industry sector pathways have really embraced and got on the bandwagon with doing a lot of data collection around this, and then another industry sector may not be. So even just looking, as we do as good researchers, look at patterns that are systematic around your missing data, it may be driven partly by some differences across pathways or CTE students versus general education students. You may see some real differences there that you don't want to have obscured by the averages that you're looking at. Jenna, did you want to share? You had a comment about the post-secondary level. Do you want to hop off mute and share that, or?
Sure. I think this is something Angela and I have talked about in the post-secondary space as well, but just about the alignment of the work-based learning experience with the program or study in the pathway, especially if we're trying to examine whether or not participating in that experience is having any kind of an impact on the students' college and career outcomes. And so, in the JFF study that Angela and I did, some of the programs required an internship, but that requirement didn't always have to be in the same area where the student's program of study was. And of course, there can be still a lot of barriers for students to finding that internship or work-based learning experience. And so I've been really curious about this idea of work-based learning alignment and how that relates sometimes to the students' pathways and programs of study, especially because so many of us are trying to understand the impact of these programs.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me open it up a little broader. What are your experiences as researchers? I know several of you said you're using these data now in your research. What are you running into that you think would be worth lifting up? Tips for other researchers as they delve into this. I mean, I know a couple of folks at the beginning mentioned that you're developing assessments, or some folks working with Portland schools on measurement. If there's any experiences you have from that, would be great to hear about. Yeah, this is a good point, Corinne, that having a comparison group is incredibly challenging because you've got sort of, in some settings we've worked in, pretty much everyone has some work-based learning, and there's no pure, no work-based learning group. And then there's sort of like this sort of dosage that's kind of all over the place in different ways. So I don't know what other folks on the panel think about that in terms of figuring out a comparison group for these kinds of studies.
I mean, ideally, right, we'd want to vary only either the presence or absence of the work-based learning, or somehow systematic differences in dosage. I think the closest that's been proposed to me is if I could look in a state context like Connecticut or Massachusetts, where work-based learning is an integrated part of let's say a full-time high school experience versus the same program. So let's say an auto mechanics program at a specialized high school that guarantees work-based learning, and some other auto mechanics program at a high school that doesn't guarantee it. Then we might look at differences within the same program of study, one having the presence of work-based learning and the other not, because otherwise the people who are self-selecting into or getting referred to something that includes work-based learning are likely systematically different than the folks who don't. And the example that I gave is a flawed one, even at that, because getting into some of these schools, right, there are unobserved factors that relate to that outcome itself.
Yeah, what are other folks finding with trying to build a comparison group for this type of study? Well, I think if there's no more questions or comments about the sort of tips for researchers, we can move to on to kind of closing reflections. So we wanted to give you a chance to think about, did you hear things today that you might want to use in your work, or that you're reflecting on how that might affect your work in some way? So you have a couple of options for sharing your thoughts. So one is you can hit this Padlet, which is, I just put the link in the chat, and I'm actually going to see if I can share the Padlet. Just to share what are the implications of what you've just heard for your work, and also feel free to either put your thoughts in the chat or just jump off mute and share as well. And if you haven't used Padlet before, it's very easy. You just click on this button at the bottom to start a new post, or you can just double click anywhere on the screen to be able to share something. Did folks hear anything that sort of resonated with them today? Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. That's weird. I did not mean. Let's share on the chat then, and just use. Well, I can try to figure out to get this set to public, but yeah, just what are your thoughts about the implications for your work, and just share it right in the chats. And I'd be especially interested in hearing from folks if you want to speak up. I know we had some folks who said they're in adult education in a very different setting, or other settings that we didn't talk about as much. Would love to hear any implications for your work, especially. Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Involving students is something we're seeing more of, and it seems like a really promising way to get more accurate and complete information. So I'll give to folks just another couple of minutes to add your thoughts in the chat or speak up. But while we're doing that, I did want to share a few resources that we mentioned today. One is the IES-funded CTE Research Network. This is the link where you can access lots of fantastic publications and tools that would be really helpful for folks. Oh, that's interesting, Sean. Do you want to say more about that, the app for work-based learning hours?
Yeah, I thought it was really clever. And of course, because it was early in the pandemic, I don't remember a thing about the organization or the person's name. But they were developing this app in conjunction, I want to say it was in Illinois or Indiana, in conjunction with schools, with the idea that students could self-report when they were like coming or going from their work-based learning experience. And I think the idea was that employers were going to be able to access that, use the same environment app to like verify, and almost just like either click to verify or make a edit to it. And I thought, like, to the extent that that was scalable through some sort of like centralized database, I thought it was a really clever way, kind of like time use diaries or things that have been used in other studies or like census data collection. It seemed like it would be, it had potential, but I never heard any more about it or learned if other folks were using it in either research or practice-based settings.
I know that in some of the districts that Brian and Kelly and I have been interviewing, that the students, a lot of these systems do have a mobile app component, and that students really like it. And so it seems like something that's taking off. And I know for our partners in California, the mobile app could also be geo-tied. So like the student had to be at the employer site where there's sort of like a beacon or something that they couldn't sign in and say they did the hours unless their phone was physically there. So there's some useful checks and balances there too. I don't know if other folks have heard some techniques like that.
Just seems like even for this audience, knowing that such things exist, it's the sort of thing that maybe you could build in or bake into a study if you could get folks to adopt it or scale it.
Absolutely.
I think that'd be helpful. I mean, we're hearing of cases with some of the districts we're working with where students like take a snapshot of their pay stub or something like that and upload it to a work-based learning coordinator, which is somewhat of an inefficient process.
Since we just have a couple minutes left, I'm going to throw these last couple of resources in the chat. Sean had talked about, is it CTEX? Is that who you say at the state consortium? I'll share this work-based learning data collection toolkit again that also has a chapter for researchers. So it has some of those tips about like things you should think about when you're working with this type of data. And Angela shared a resource on community college STEM work-based learning, which you can also access here from WestEd. Want to make sure folks had all those. And in addition, we are happy to answer questions that you guys might have. I'm going to put our contact information of the group of us in the chat as well, or you can probably access it from the meeting portal. But you can reach us with any questions. I'll start with myself and I'll add the others in a second. So thank you very much for your time today. And it's been really interesting to hear what other folks are working on in terms of this important area that we're just kind of exploring and trying to build out these days. So please be in touch with any thoughts. And yes, thank you. There's also a networking session right after this for folks that might be interesting to folks who are here. So thank you all for being here. And we got other presenters' emails also appearing in the chat. Thank you for that.